August 9th, 48 BC, the plains of Thessaly, central Greece. The morning sun cast long shadows across two massive armies, preparing to decide the fate of the Roman world. On one side stood Pompey the Great, conqueror of the East, commanding 45,000 Roman infantry and 7,000 cavalry. On the other, Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, with barely 22,000 legionaries and 1,000 horsemen. The numbers told a simple story. Pompey held every advantage: more men, more cavalry, better supplies, naval superiority, the backing of the Roman Senate. Caesar's army was hungry, battered, reduced to baking bread from weeds and roots after their defeat at Dyrrhachium just weeks before. By every conventional measure, this should have been a massacre. What happened instead was one of the most brilliant tactical victories in military history, a battle where Roman infantry, outnumbered and outmatched, destroyed a cavalry force 7 times their number. This is the story of how Caesar's legionaries learned to fight cavalry with javelins aimed at faces, how tactical genius overcame numerical superiority, and how a single morning changed the course of Western civilization forever. The road to Pharsalus began 18 months earlier, when Caesar made a decision that would plunge Rome into civil war. In January 49 BC, standing at the banks of the Rubicon River, the boundary between Gaul and Italy, Caesar faced an impossible choice. The Roman Senate, led by his former ally Pompey, had ordered him to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. They knew what would happen next. Without military protection, Caesar would face prosecution in Rome's political courts, charges brought by enemies who controlled the legal system. His career would be destroyed, his life likely forfeit. Caesar's legions had followed him for 9 years through Gaul, Germania, and Britannia. They had conquered territories twice the size of Italy itself. They had crossed the Rhine into lands no Roman had ever seen. They had sailed to the mysterious island of Britannia at the edge of the known world. These were not just soldiers. They were veterans of hundreds of battles, men who had shared hunger and victory, who had divided plunder and mourned fallen comrades. The decision Caesar made that January morning would define an empire. He ordered his legions across the Rubicon, speaking words that would echo through history. The die is cast. By crossing that river with armed troops, Caesar became an invader of his own country, an outlaw in the eyes of Roman law. Pompey and the Senate abandoned Italy. They retreated east to Greece, to territories Pompey had conquered years before, lands where his network of client kings and loyal provinces could raise vast armies. It was a strategic retreat, trading space for time, giving them months to build a force that could crush Caesar's veterans. Throughout 49 and into 48 BC, Caesar moved with characteristic speed. He secured Spain, defeating Pompeian legions there. He returned to Italy, raised more troops, and in January 48 BC, in the dead of winter when no sane commander would risk a naval crossing, he sailed for Greece. He landed in Epirus with 7 legions, catching Pompey completely off guard. Mark Antony followed later with 4 more legions, but even united, Caesar's forces were outnumbered. The two armies shadowed each other for months, neither willing to commit to a decisive battle. Pompey's strategy was simple and sound. Avoid battle, use his naval superiority to control supplies, let Caesar's army starve and diminish. Time was on Pompey's side. Every week that passed, more troops arrived from the eastern provinces. Caesar's only hope was a decisive engagement, a single battle where his veteran legionaries could prove their worth. He tried to force Pompey's hand at Dyrrhachium on the coast of Albania. Caesar attempted to besiege Pompey's much larger force, building miles of fortifications to trap them against the sea. It was an audacious plan that nearly succeeded, but Pompey's forces broke through Caesar's lines in July 48 BC, inflicting heavy casualties. Caesar lost the battle and was forced to retreat. His situation had become desperate. His army was running out of food. His men were literally baking bread from roots and weeds. Pompey had won a clear victory and held every advantage. The logical move was to continue the strategy of attrition, to pursue Caesar's weakened army while avoiding major battle. But Pompey faced pressure from a different enemy, the senators and nobles who formed his political base. These men, safe in Pompey's camp, had not fought in Gaul. They had not faced Caesar's legions in combat. They saw only the numbers, 45,000 infantry against 22,000, 7-to-1 superiority in cavalry. They saw an enemy in retreat, hungry and demoralized. Victory seemed inevitable, and they wanted it now. They mocked Pompey for his caution. They accused him of prolonging the war to maintain his command, of cowardice, of being too old for decisive action. The pressure became unbearable. Against his better judgment, against his instincts as a commander, Pompey agreed to seek battle. He led his army south into Thessaly, pursuing Caesar's retreating forces. By early August, the two armies were camped 4 miles apart on the plains near the town of Pharsalus. The stage was set for the largest battle between Roman armies in history. Caesar deployed his forces first on the morning of August 9th. He placed his legions in the traditional Roman formation, 3 lines deep, the triplex aces that had served Rome for centuries. His left flank rested on the Enipeus River, a stream with steep banks that protected that side from cavalry attack. He placed the exhausted 9th Legion there, supplemented by the 8th, both units so depleted by disease and casualties that they operated as a single formation. Mark Antony commanded this wing. The centre consisted of the 6th, 12th, 11th and 13th Legions under Domitius. The right wing, the place of honour, went to the 10th Legion, Caesar's favourites, the unit that had served him throughout the Gallic Wars. These men had fought at the Sabes River, at Alesia, in Germania and Britannia. They were commanded by Sulla, but Caesar himself took position on the right wing directly across from Pompey. This was where the battle would be decided, because here was Caesar's problem. With only 22,000 men facing 45,000, he couldn't match Pompey's front. Roman formations worked best when lines were continuous, when each man's shield protected his neighbour. But Caesar had to stretch his forces thin, forming his lines just 6 men deep instead of the usual 10, just to match the frontage of Pompey's army. Even then, his right flank was exposed. The Enipeus River protected his left, but his right was open to the plain where Pompey had massed virtually all of his 7,000 cavalry. Pompey's battle plan was straightforward and should have been devastating. He placed his strongest legions in the centre and wings of his infantry line. He dispersed 2,000 re-enlisted veterans throughout the formation to steady the newer recruits. His infantry was arrayed unusually deep, 10 men per file because Pompey didn't really trust them. Many were fresh recruits. Many were foreign auxiliaries from client kingdoms. They weren't the hardened veterans Caesar commanded, but Pompey believed his infantry didn't need to win. They just needed to hold, to pin Caesar's legions in place while the real strike came from the cavalry. Pompey concentrated almost his entire mounted force on his left wing, directly opposite Caesar's right. 7,000 horsemen, a massive formation including Gallic and Germanic cavalry, brought by Titus Labienus, Caesar's former second-in-command who had defected to Pompey at the war's start. Behind the cavalry, Pompey positioned 3,000 archers and slingers, missile troops who could shower Caesar's formations with arrows and stones once the cavalry broke through. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The infantry lines would engage. While they fought, Labienus would lead the cavalry charge against Caesar's right flank. Caesar had only 1,000 cavalry to oppose them. They would be swept aside easily. With the cavalry gone, Pompey's mounted force would swing around behind Caesar's lines, attacking his favoured 10th Legion from the rear. Caught between Pompey's infantry in front and cavalry behind, Caesar's army would be destroyed. It was a sound plan. It should have worked. Every military principle suggested it would work. Cavalry had tremendous advantages over infantry. Speed, shock, the psychological impact of mounted warriors thundering down on foot soldiers. Throughout ancient warfare, cavalry breaking into the rear of an infantry formation meant catastrophe. The men would panic, try to face threats from multiple directions, lose cohesion, and be cut down. Pompey himself commanded from the left wing, positioning himself where he could, personally oversee the cavalry strike that would win the war. Labienus, eager to destroy his former commander, took direct control of the mounted forces. Everything was ready. But Caesar was watching. As the armies deployed that morning, he observed Pompey's cavalry concentration on the left. He saw the danger immediately. His own cavalry would be overwhelmed in minutes. His right flank would be exposed. His army would be surrounded and annihilated. And so, Caesar made a decision that would rewrite military history. He gave orders to his officers in the third line, the reserve troops not yet engaged in combat. From each of his legions, he wanted one cohort pulled out and formed into a new unit. This would be a fourth line, something unprecedented in Roman tactics. Cohorts were the basic unit of the Roman legion, roughly 480 men each. Caesar had 9 understrength legions, so this fourth line would consist of approximately 8 cohorts, somewhere between 2,400 and 3,000 men. He positioned these cohorts behind and to the right of his cavalry, angled to face where Pompey's mounted force would come. Most critically, he told them to conceal themselves, to stay low, to let Pompey's cavalry think they faced only Caesar's 1,000 horsemen and the exposed flank of the 10th Legion. Then Caesar gave them their orders, and these orders broke every rule of infantry combat. When he gave the signal, they were to charge directly at Pompey's cavalry. They were not to throw their javelins, the pilum, the standard Roman throwing spear designed to punch through shields and pin them to the ground. Instead, they were to use their pila as thrusting spears, handheld weapons for close combat. Most importantly, they were to aim for the faces of the cavalry, aim for their eyes, their mouths, their throats, aim upward, targeting the most vulnerable part of the mounted warriors. According to Plutarch, Caesar explained his reasoning with brutal clarity. Those fine young dancers won't endure the steel shining in their eyes, they'll fly to save their handsome faces. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. Caesar understood something about Pompey's cavalry that Pompey himself had missed. Many of these horsemen were wealthy young nobles from Rome and the eastern provinces. They were proud of their appearance, proud of their fine armour and magnificent horses. They valued their looks, their status, their dignity. They had joined the cavalry for glory, to be part of the decisive strike, to be there when victory was won. They had not joined to have their faces shredded by iron-tipped spears. They were not experienced frontier cavalry who had fought desperate battles on hostile borders. They were aristocrats playing at war. Caesar was betting everything that when faced with javelins aimed at their eyes, aimed at their mouths, aimed to blind and disfigure them, these cavalry would break and run. It was an enormous gamble. If it failed, his fourth line would be trampled. By 7,000 horsemen, his flank would be destroyed, and his army would be annihilated. But if it worked, if he could break Pompey's cavalry, then that enormous mounted force would become a liability, a panicked mass fleeing through their own lines, disrupting the entire Pompeian left wing. The time for speculation was over. Around mid-morning on August 9th, 48 BC, the trumpets sounded. The Battle of Pharsalus had begun. Caesar's legionaries started forward, marching in their precise formations toward Pompey's lines. This was the critical moment in Roman battle tactics. Normally, legionaries would march forward, building momentum until they came within javelin range. Then they would launch their pila in coordinated volleys, hundreds of heavy spears arcing through the air, punching through shields, disrupting enemy formations. After throwing their javelins, they would draw their gladi, the short stabbing swords, and charge into close combat. But something unexpected happened. Caesar's veterans, men who had fought together for years, who knew each other's movements instinctively, suddenly slowed their advance. They had noticed that Pompey's infantry wasn't advancing to meet them. Pompey had ordered his legions to stand firm, to let Caesar's men exhaust themselves crossing the open ground, to receive the charge from a static defensive position. It was a reasonable tactic intended to preserve his formation's integrity and tire Caesar's soldiers before combat. But Caesar's veterans, without orders, without breaking formation, simply stopped advancing midway across the field. They stood there, catching their breath, maintaining their formation, waiting. It was an extraordinary display of discipline and tactical awareness. These were not raw recruits mindlessly following orders. These were professional soldiers who understood battlefield dynamics, who could collectively make decisions in the moment. After a brief pause, they resumed their advance, fresh and ready for combat. They threw their pila at optimal range and crashed into Pompey's lines with full force. The centre and left of both armies engaged in brutal close-quarters combat. Shield pressed against shield, gladi stabbing between the gaps, men shouting and dying, the grinding, exhausting work of Roman infantry warfare. But this fight in the centre was not where the battle would be decided. Everyone on that field knew it. All eyes turned to the right wing, where Pompey's great cavalry force prepared to make their strike. Labienus gave the order. 7,000 horsemen began to move, starting at a trot, building to a canter, the ground shaking with the thunder of hoofbeats. Behind them, 3,000 archers and slingers rushed forward, taking position behind their own cavalry, preparing to rain missiles on Caesar's exposed formations. Caesar's 1,000 German and Gallic cavalry, commanded by Sulla, moved forward to meet them. It was hopeless. 7,000 against 1,000. The outcome seemed inevitable. The cavalry forces collided in a massive melee. Caesar's Germanic and Gallic horsemen fought desperately, but the weight of numbers began to tell. They started giving ground, being pushed back, exactly as everyone expected. On Pompey's left wing, confidence surged. The plan was working perfectly. Caesar's cavalry was breaking. The 10th Legion's right flank was exposed. In moments, Labienus would wheel his cavalry around and strike Caesar's legendary legion from behind. Victory was at hand. This was the moment Caesar had been waiting for. The moment when Pompey's cavalry was fully committed, pressing forward, focused on Caesar's retreating horsemen, beginning to think about their next move, about wheeling to attack the 10th Legion's flank. This was when Caesar gave the signal. Trumpets blared. 3,000 Roman legionaries who had been concealed behind Caesar's cavalry suddenly stood up and charged, not at Pompey's infantry, at his cavalry. The Pompeian horsemen never saw them coming. The mounted warriors were focused forward, chasing Caesar's retreating cavalry, reforming their lines, preparing for the flanking maneuver. Some were already trying to wheel right to strike the 10th Legion. The formations were in natural disorder, some units pushing forward, others pulling back to reform, others turning. And then, out of nowhere, 3,000 heavily armed Roman infantry came sprinting across the field directly at them. What happened next defied all conventional military wisdom. Infantry charging cavalry should have been suicide. Horses were faster, stronger, could simply ride down and trample foot soldiers. Cavalry could strike and withdraw before infantry could react. This was established military doctrine across every ancient army. But doctrine assumed that cavalry was organized, that it had room to maneuver, that its warriors were prepared for infantry attack. Pompey's cavalry had none of these advantages. They were caught in disorder, their lines compressed, their attention elsewhere, and Caesar's fourth-line legionaries were not ordinary infantry. These were cohorts hand-picked from Caesar's veteran legions. Men who had fought Germanic tribes and British chariots, who had stormed Gallic fortifications, who had faced down Celtic cavalry charges in the forests of Gaul. They were the best soldiers in Caesar's army, and they were fighting for their lives. The legionaries slammed into the cavalry formations with devastating effect. But they weren't fighting the way infantry normally fought cavalry. They weren't trying to cut at the horses' legs or dodge around mounted warriors. They were executing Caesar's specific, brutal instructions. They kept their pila held tightly as thrusting spears. They aimed upward, and they targeted faces. The iron tips of Roman javelins, normally thrown to pierce shields and armour, became handheld weapons designed for maximum psychological impact. The legionaries thrust upward, stabbing at eyes, mouths, noses, throats. Facial wounds are uniquely horrifying. They bleed profusely, cause instant agony, and create panic in ways that wounds to the body do not. A man can fight with an injured arm or leg. He cannot fight with his face shredded, with blood pouring into his eyes, with iron punching through his jaw or nose. Pompey's cavalry, those fine young nobles in their polished armour on their magnificent horses, had never experienced anything like this. Most of them had minimal combat experience. They had joined this army because Pompey was winning, because they were supposed to be part of a glorious victory, because they wanted to say they had fought in the great battle. They had not joined to have their faces destroyed by screaming Roman infantry. The ancient sources describe what happened next with almost clinical precision. Plutarch records that the cavalry were so far from bearing the stroke of the javelins that they could not stand the sight of them. They turned about and covered their faces to secure them. The psychological effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. These were men who valued their appearance, their status, their dignity. Facial disfigurement in Roman society meant social death. These aristocratic cavalry would rather flee than risk having their faces shredded, and flee they did. The initial ranks of Labienus's best cavalry, caught by surprise by the infantry charge, tried to fight back. But the legionaries kept coming, kept thrusting their pila upward, kept aiming for faces. Hundreds of cavalrymen fell in the first moments, not killed necessarily, but wounded in the face, reeling back in pain and terror, horses panicking at their riders' sudden loss of control. The cavalry behind them, seeing the carnage in front, seeing their comrades clutching their faces, seeing blood and chaos and Romans who shouldn't have been there, made an instant decision. They turned and ran, Not an organised retreat, not a tactical withdrawal, a panicked rout. 7,000 cavalry, Pompey's entire striking force, the unit that was supposed to win the battle, broke and fled in absolute terror. Labienus, the former Caesarian general, tried desperately to rally his men. He was a skilled cavalry commander who had led Germanic horsemen through campaigns across Gaul. But there was nothing he could do. The cavalry had shattered completely. All he could do was ride after his fleeing troops, trying to regroup them somewhere away from the battle. But Caesar's fourth line wasn't finished. They had routed the cavalry, but they kept moving. The 3,000 archers and slingers positioned behind Pompey's cavalry suddenly found themselves facing 3,000 Roman legionaries. Archers and slingers were light troops, not equipped for close combat. They wore no armour, they carried no shields. Their weapons were designed to kill at a distance. In close quarters against heavy infantry, they had no chance whatsoever. The legionaries cut through them like wheat before a scythe. The archers and slingers were massacred, dying by the hundreds as they tried desperately to run. Within minutes, Pompey's entire left wing, cavalry and missile troops had been destroyed or scattered. 10,000 men removed from the battle in a single devastating stroke. But Caesar's fourth line was not done. They halted, reformed their lines, and executed the final phase of Caesar's plan. They wheeled inward and struck the exposed left flank and rear of Pompey's main infantry line. This was every Roman commander's nightmare, being attacked from the side and rear while engaged frontally. Pompey's legions on the left wing, the 1st and 15th, were elite units, some of Pompey's best troops, but they were locked in combat with Caesar's 10th Legion and centre formations. They couldn't turn to face the new threat without breaking their formation and exposing themselves to the troops they were already fighting. Caesar's fourth line crashed into them from the flank and rear. At the same moment, Caesar gave another order. His entire third line, the reserve units that had been waiting throughout the battle, surged forward. Fresh troops who hadn't yet fought threw themselves into the battle, relieving the exhausted first and second lines, renewing the frontal assault with devastating energy. Pompey's left wing disintegrated. The elite 1st Legion, the same unit that had served under Caesar in Gaul, that had been given to Pompey years before, that was supposed to be his best infantry, broke and fled. The collapse spread like a contagion. Units to the right, seeing their flank destroyed, seeing Caesar's troops pouring into their rear, tried to wheel their formations to face the new threat. This created chaos, gaps in the line, disorder that Caesar's veterans exploited ruthlessly. Pompey, watching from his position behind the left wing, saw his entire battle plan collapse in minutes. The cavalry he'd been depending on for victory had fled the field. His supposedly unbreakable left wing was being destroyed. His legions were being surrounded. The great Pompey the Great, conqueror of the East, who had never lost a battle, who had defeated pirates and kings, stood paralysed as his army disintegrated around him. Without a word, without giving orders, Pompey turned his horse and rode back to his camp. His staff, stunned, followed. According to Plutarch, when Pompey reached the praetorian gate of his camp, looking pale and dazed, he told the centurions on duty to defend the camp strenuously if there should be any reverse in the battle. Then he said he was going to check the guard at the other gates. But he didn't check the other gates. He went straight to his headquarters tent and sat there, waiting, while his army was annihilated outside. The infantry battle, once Pompey's left collapsed, became a slaughter. Caesar's legions, energized by the sudden reversal, pressed forward with savage intensity. Pompey's centre and right wing, seeing the collapse on their left, seeing enemy troops in their rear, tried to hold position. Some units fought with desperate courage. But they were surrounded, outnumbered at the point of contact, being attacked from multiple directions. The Pompeian line broke. Thousands of soldiers tried to retreat to their fortified camp on the hill behind the battlefield. Caesar pressed his advantage ruthlessly. He ordered his troops forward, giving them no time to rest or reorganize. He wanted to capture Pompey's camp before the defenders could establish a solid defense. The Caesarian legions stormed the camp walls. Pompey's legions, demoralized and leaderless, their commander having abandoned them in the middle of the battle, put up minimal resistance. The camp fell. Inside, Caesar's soldiers found a scene of surreal luxury. Pompey and his senatorial allies had been so confident of victory that they had prepared a celebration feast. Tables were set with fine silver, tents decorated with ivy and flowers, wine prepared. It was a victory banquet for a battle they had lost. Pompey himself was already gone. When his camp began to fall, he had thrown off his general's cloak, the scarlet paludamentum that identified him as commander. He disguised himself as an ordinary soldier and fled with a small escort, riding north toward Larissa. Behind him, his army ceased to exist as an organized force. Those who could flee did so, retreating to high ground, trying to regroup. Caesar besieged them that evening, surrounding the hill where they had taken refuge, cutting off any retreat. By dawn of August the 10th, what remained of Pompey's army surrendered. The casualties told the story of one-sided slaughter. Caesar claimed 15,000 of Pompey's soldiers were killed, though modern historians suggest closer to 6,000 dead. Another 24,000 surrendered. Of Caesar's forces, he reported losses of only 200 men, though the real number was probably closer to 200 dead. But even at the higher estimate, the ratio was devastating. Caesar had achieved a 5-to-1 or greater kill ratio while outnumbered 2-to-1. While his army was starving and exhausted from previous defeats, it was one of the most lopsided victories in military history. But the numbers don't convey the true significance of what happened on the plains of Pharsalus. This wasn't just a battle, it was a revolution in military tactics. Caesar had solved a problem that had plagued infantry commanders for centuries. How do you defeat heavy cavalry when outnumbered? The conventional answer was, you don't. You hope your own cavalry can hold them, you protect your flanks with terrain, you avoid the engagement entirely. Caesar did none of those things. He chose to fight on open ground where cavalry had maximum advantage. He faced a mounted force 7 times the size of his own, and he destroyed them with infantry, using tactics that shouldn't have worked. The key was understanding psychology as much as tactics. Caesar recognized that Pompey's cavalry weren't veteran warriors hardened by frontier battles. They were aristocrats, proud men fighting for glory and status. He recognized that facial wounds created panic out of proportion to their lethality. He understood that cavalry caught in disorder, compressed, unable to maneuver, lost their primary advantages. And he understood timing. He waited until Pompey's cavalry was fully committed, focused elsewhere, before springing his trap. The innovation of the fourth line itself was remarkable. Roman armies traditionally fought in 3 lines, the triplex aces. The first line engaged the enemy, the second line supported and relieved them, the third line served as reserve, ready to exploit breakthroughs or cover retreats. Caesar created a fourth line, pulling cohorts from his already thin formations, positioning them out of sight, using them as a mobile strike force targeted at a specific threat. This was combined arms warfare at its finest. Caesar's fourth line didn't just charge cavalry blindly. They waited for Caesar's own cavalry to engage, drawing Pompey's mounted forces forward. Then the infantry struck while the cavalry was distracted and disordered. After routing the cavalry, the infantry didn't stop. They pursued, destroying the supporting archers and slingers, then wheeled inward to attack Pompey's exposed flank. Each phase flowed into the next with precision timing. This required extraordinary discipline from the infantry. They had to remain concealed while watching their own cavalry get pushed back. They had to charge on command, not breaking ranks despite facing 7,000 horsemen. They had to execute a complex series of maneuvers, rout, pursue, wheel, attack, while maintaining unit cohesion. This was only possible because of the quality of Caesar's legionaries. These were not conscripts or raw recruits. These were professionals who had served for years, who trusted their commander completely, who could execute complex orders in the chaos of battle. They were veterans of the Gallic Wars, men who had seen every possible type of combat. They had fought Germanic tribal cavalry, British chariots, Gallic infantry, Helvethian migrations, rebellions, sieges, river crossings, night battles, winter campaigns. There was nothing they hadn't experienced. When Caesar told them to charge cavalry with handheld javelins, aiming for faces, they didn't hesitate. They had seen Caesar's unorthodox tactics work before. At the Battle of the Sabis River, outnumbered and ambushed, Caesar's legions had turned certain defeat into victory through aggressive counterattack. At Alesia, Caesar had built double fortifications, one facing inward to besiege the Gallic stronghold, one facing outward to defend against the relief army. He had won by being attacked from 2 sides simultaneously. These soldiers had learned that conventional tactics didn't apply when Caesar commanded. If he said charge cavalry, there was a reason, and that reason would save their lives. The trust between Caesar and his legions was absolute. This relationship was itself revolutionary. Roman armies were traditionally loyal to Rome, to the Republic, to abstract principles. Caesar's legions were loyal to Caesar personally. He had enriched them with plunder from Gaul. He had promoted talented men regardless of birth. He had shared their hardships, building bridges alongside his engineers, eating the same bread as his soldiers during food shortages. He knew his centurions by name, remembered their battles, honoured their courage. This personal loyalty made Caesar's army more cohesive, more motivated and more willing to attempt impossible tasks than their opponents. Pompey's forces lacked this unity. His legions were a mixture of veterans from various campaigns, new recruits from Italy, foreign auxiliaries from client kingdoms. Many served because they were ordered to by their local rulers. Some served for pay, some served because they opposed Caesar politically. But few served with the fierce personal devotion that Caesar's legionaries felt for their commander. This difference in motivation showed during the battle. When Caesar's fourth line charged cavalry, they did it without hesitation, trusting that Caesar's plan would work. When Pompey's cavalry faced unexpected infantry attack, many immediately thought about self-preservation, about saving their faces from disfigurement, about fleeing to fight another day. The battle also demonstrated the importance of battlefield command presence. Caesar personally positioned himself on the right wing, the point of danger, where he could observe Pompey's cavalry concentration and react. He was there when he gave the order for the fourth line to charge. He was visible to his troops sharing their risks. Pompey, by contrast, positioned himself behind his left wing, in a command position where he could observe but not directly lead. When his battle plan collapsed, he had no immediate way to adapt. When his cavalry fled, he was too far back to rally them. When his infantry started to break, he couldn't inspire them to hold. His response was to flee to his tent and wait for the inevitable defeat. This passivity in crisis was completely unlike the Pompey who had earned his reputation as the Great. The younger Pompey had been bold, aggressive, willing to take risks. The Pompey at Pharsalus was exhausted, pressured by political allies, fighting a battle he didn't want against an enemy he feared. His defeat was psychological as much as tactical. The consequences of Pharsalus extended far beyond the battlefield. In the immediate aftermath, Pompey fled east to Egypt, hoping to find sanctuary with Ptolemy III, the boy king of Egypt. Ptolemy's kingdom owed its existence to Pompey, who had confirmed the Egyptian throne years before. Surely Egypt would provide refuge. But when Pompey arrived at Alexandria's harbour on September the 28th, 48 BC, Ptolemy's advisors made a calculated decision. They knew Caesar was pursuing. They knew Caesar had won decisively. They decided that Pompey alive was a liability, while Pompey dead might earn them favour with the new master of Rome. As Pompey's boat approached the shore, Egyptian soldiers met him. They invited him to come ashore personally, claiming the shallow waters prevented his ship from landing at the dock. Pompey agreed, leaving his wife and retinue on the ship. He stepped into a small boat with several Egyptian soldiers. As soon as they were out of sight of Pompey's ship, the Egyptians stabbed him in the back. They cut off his head and left his body on the beach. When Caesar arrived in Egypt days later, Ptolemy's representatives presented him with Pompey's head and his signet ring, expecting gratitude. According to multiple ancient sources, Caesar wept. Whether this was genuine grief or political theatre remains debated. Caesar and Pompey had been allies, family even. Pompey had been married to Caesar's daughter Julia. They had ruled together as part of the first triumvirate. They had only become enemies through political circumstances, escalating tensions and the structural problems of the late Republic. Caesar had pursued Pompey intending to capture, not kill him. He had planned to pardon Pompey, to welcome him back to Rome, to reconcile with his former ally. This was Caesar's consistent policy throughout the civil war. He pardoned enemies, promoted former opponents to positions of power, sought reconciliation over revenge. This clemency was partly calculated, it won him support and reduced resistance. But it also reflected Caesar's vision for Rome's future. He understood that killing his opponents would only perpetuate the cycle of civil war. Pompey's murder by Egyptian hands robbed Caesar of the chance to demonstrate this mercy publicly, but he showed it in other ways. He pardoned many of the senators who had fought against him at Pharsalus. Marcus Brutus, who had been on Pompey's side, became one of Caesar's closest associates. Cicero, who had supported Pompey, was welcomed back to Rome with honour. This policy of clemency was revolutionary in Roman politics, where victors traditionally proscribed their enemies, confiscating property and ordering executions. Caesar offered something different, a way to end civil war without mass bloodshed among the Roman elite. But the cost of Pharsalus was enormous nonetheless. 6,000 Roman soldiers died on that field, Romans killing Romans in the largest battle between Roman armies in history. The political consequences were even more severe. Pharsalus marked the effective end of the Roman Republic. For 5 centuries, Rome had been governed by elected magistrates, by the Senate, by a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent any one man from gaining supreme power. That system had been breaking down for decades, through social conflicts, military reforms that tied legions to generals rather than the state, and the emergence of warlords who commanded personal armies. The first triumvirate of Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus had been an unconstitutional arrangement, 3 powerful men dividing Rome's provinces and military commands among themselves. When Crassus died fighting the Parthians in 53 BC, the alliance collapsed into rivalry between the 2 remaining triumvirs. The civil war was the Republic's death spasm. After Pharsalus, after Pompey's death, Caesar's supremacy was unchallenged. Fighting continued for several more years. Pompey's sons and surviving allies resisted in Africa and Spain. Caesar won battles at Thapsus in 46 BC and Munda in 45 BC before the war finally ended. But these were aftershocks. The decisive moment was Pharsalus. By 44 BC, Caesar had accumulated unprecedented power. He was dictator of Rome, not the temporary emergency position the title originally meant, but a permanent dictatorship. He reformed the calendar, expanded the Senate, initiated massive building projects, planned campaigns against Parthia. He ruled as an autocrat, making decisions that would have required Senate approval in the Old Republic. A group of senators, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, decided that Caesar had become the tyrant the Republic's founders had feared. On March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March, they assassinated him in the Senate House. Caesar fell with 23 stab wounds. His death didn't restore the Republic. Instead, it triggered more civil wars, another 13 years of conflict, until Caesar's adopted heir Octavian defeated his rivals and became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic was gone forever, replaced by an imperial system that would last another 5 centuries. And all of this traced back to that August morning in 48 BC when Roman infantry charged cavalry and won. The tactical lessons of Pharsalus echoed through military history. Caesar demonstrated that infantry, properly led and positioned, could defeat cavalry through unorthodox methods. The key was disrupting cavalry's advantages, catching them in disorder, removing their ability to maneuver, attacking weak points, in this case, the psychological weakness of young aristocratic riders who couldn't endure facial wounds. Later commanders would study Pharsalus and draw their own lessons. Some focused on Caesar's use of reserves, how he created a mobile strike force from his third line. Some emphasized his battlefield intelligence, his ability to read Pompey's dispositions and devise a counter. Some noted his timing, waiting for exactly the right moment to spring his trap. But perhaps the most important lesson was about leadership and the nature of military excellence. Caesar won Pharsalus because his soldiers trusted him completely. That trust was earned through years of shared hardship and victory. It allowed him to ask them to attempt the seemingly impossible, to charge cavalry with handheld spears and have them execute flawlessly. Modern military theorists still study Pharsalus as an example of how tactical genius and troop quality can overcome numerical disadvantage. It's taught at military academies worldwide as a masterclass in combined arms warfare, in the use of reserves, in exploiting enemy weaknesses. But we should also remember the human cost. Those 6,000 Roman soldiers who died on the field at Pharsalus were men with families, with hopes, with lives cut short. They died fighting other Romans in a civil war that destroyed their republic. The veterans of Caesar's legions who executed his brilliant plan would never see lasting peace. Many would die in subsequent civil wars after Caesar's assassination. The survivors would live to see the republic they had known transform into an empire. Pompey himself, despite his defeat, deserves recognition. He had been one of Rome's greatest generals, achieving victories across the Mediterranean, establishing Roman power in the east, clearing the sea of pirates. His failure at Pharsalus came partly from circumstances, fighting a battle he didn't want under political pressure, facing an enemy whose tactical genius exceeded even his own considerable skills. And the battle itself, for all its tactical brilliance, represented a tragedy. Two of Rome's greatest commanders, who together could have conquered Parthia, could have extended Roman power to the ends of the known world, instead destroyed each other. 70,000 Roman soldiers faced each other on that plain, and Rome itself was poorer for it. On August 9th, 48 BC, Roman infantry defeated heavy cavalry through a combination of tactical innovation, psychological insight, perfect timing, and extraordinary discipline. Caesar's fourth line, charging with javelins held as spears, aiming for the faces of Pompey's cavalry, achieved what conventional military wisdom said was impossible. They routed 7,000 mounted warriors, destroyed Pompey's battle plan, and won the decisive battle that ended the Republic. The javelins aimed at faces, the terrified cavalry fleeing to protect their handsome faces, the aristocratic warriors who couldn't endure steel shining in their eyes. These images captured the essence of that extraordinary day. In that moment, when infantry charged cavalry and won, Caesar rewrote the rules of ancient warfare, and in doing so, he changed the course of Western civilization forever. The plains of Pharsalus, watered with Roman blood, witnessed the death of the Republic and the birth of empire, and at the centre of it all were Roman legionaries, Caesar's veterans, who charged cavalry because their commander told them to, who aimed their javelins at faces because that was the order, and who won because they trusted Caesar more than they feared death. That trust, that discipline, that willingness to attempt the impossible was Caesar's true weapon at Pharsalus. The fourth line was just the instrument. The real force that won the battle was the unbreakable bond between a general and his soldiers, forged through 9 years of war in Gaul, Germania, and Britannia. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon 18 months before Pharsalus, he had reportedly said, "The die is cast." On August 9th, 48 BC, that die finished rolling, and the result was empire. The transformation of Roman military doctrine after Pharsalus was immediate and profound. Within months, commanders across the Republic were studying Caesar's tactics, trying to understand how infantry had achieved the impossible. Letters and reports circulated among military circles, carrying eyewitness accounts from centurions who had fought in the fourth line, from cavalry officers who had watched Pompey's horsemen disintegrate, from staff officers who had observed the entire battle from Caesar's command position. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, who had commanded Caesar's left wing at Pharsalus, incorporated the lessons into his own tactical thinking. Years later, during his campaigns in the East, Antony would use similar tactics against Parthian cavalry, creating mobile infantry reserves specifically designed to counter mounted forces. The difference was that Parthian cavalry were not Roman aristocrats concerned about their faces. They were professional horse archers from the steppes, veterans of a culture that lived on horseback. Antony's attempts to replicate Caesar's success met with mixed results, proving that tactical genius required adaptation to specific circumstances, not mere repetition of past victories. But within Rome's legions, the fourth-line concept became standard doctrine. Training manuals began including specific instructions for infantry anti-cavalry tactics. Recruits practiced thrusting techniques with pila, learning to aim upward, to target riders rather than horses. Centurions drilled their cohorts in rapid formation changes, teaching them how to shift from standard battle lines into specialized anti-cavalry formations. The pilum itself evolved. While it remained primarily a throwing weapon, smiths began experimenting with designs that made it more effective as a thrusting spear. Some units adopted longer pilae with reinforced shafts that could serve dual purposes. Others carried two different types, light throwing spears for initial volleys and heavier thrusting spears for close combat. The psychological impact of Pharsalus on Roman cavalry was equally significant, though in a different way. Roman and Italian cavalry had always been considered inferior to specialist mounted forces from Gaul, Germania, and the East. Romans were infantrymen by tradition and temperament. Their cavalry had typically been recruited from allies and auxiliaries who came from horse-riding cultures. After Pharsalus, this assumption hardened into doctrine. If even 7,000 cavalry could be defeated by 3,000 infantry, then cavalry's role was clearly limited. Roman military thinking increasingly saw mounted forces as scouts, skirmishers, and pursuers rather than decisive battlefield weapons. This would have consequences centuries later when Rome faced enemies like the Parthians and later the Sassanid Persians, whose entire military systems were built around heavy cavalry. Roman infantry remained supreme, but the neglect of cavalry development created vulnerabilities that clever enemies could exploit. The battle also fundamentally changed Roman perceptions of Caesar himself. Before Pharsalus, Caesar had been seen as a talented general, certainly, the conqueror of Gaul, a commander who won victories. But so had many others. Pompey had conquered the East, Marius had defeated the Germanic tribes, Sulla had won Rome's civil wars a generation earlier. Great generals were not uncommon in Roman history. After Pharsalus, Caesar was viewed differently. He had defeated Rome's most experienced commander while outnumbered, with a starving army, after suffering a major defeat just weeks earlier. He had solved a tactical problem that had no solution. He had invented a new formation, a fourth line, in the middle of a campaign, and used it to destroy a force that should have annihilated his army. This wasn't just talent. This was genius operating at a level few commanders in history had achieved. The soldiers who served under Caesar knew they were part of something extraordinary. After Pharsalus, recruitment into Caesar's legions became highly desirable. Young men from across Italy volunteered, hoping to serve under the general who had proven himself the greatest military mind of the age. Veterans of Pharsalus became legendary figures in their own right. Centurions who had led cohorts in the fourth line were promoted rapidly, their experience considered invaluable. Common soldiers who had charged Pompey's cavalry became heroes in their hometowns, their stories told and retold until they became part of Roman folklore. The economic impact of the battle was staggering. Pompey's war chest, accumulated from years of controlling the eastern provinces, fell into Caesar's hands. The treasure seized from Pompey's camp at Pharsalus included gold and silver valued at hundreds of millions of sesterces. This wealth, combined with the wealth of Egypt which Caesar would acquire during his subsequent adventures there, and the riches of the eastern provinces that fell under his control, made Caesar the wealthiest individual in Roman history. He used this money strategically. He paid his soldiers generous bonuses, far exceeding the standard rewards for victory. He paid off debts for allies and supporters throughout Italy. He funded massive public works projects, building temples, forums, and infrastructure that employed thousands of Roman citizens. He bought loyalty and legitimacy through calculated generosity, using Pompey's captured wealth to secure his own political position. But money alone couldn't solve the fundamental problem that Pharsalus had created. Rome had destroyed the political system that had made it great. The Republic's strength had come from shared power, from the tension between different factions and interests, from the requirement that military commanders answer to civilian authorities. Caesar, after Pharsalus, answered to no one. His legions followed him personally. His wealth exceeded the state treasury. His military genius was unmatched. The institutions that were supposed to limit individual power had proven powerless against a general who commanded absolute loyalty from his troops. The senators who would eventually assassinate Caesar understood this clearly. They weren't simply jealous rivals or power-hungry politicians, though some were. Many genuinely believed that Caesar's continued existence was incompatible with republican government. As long as he lived, Rome would be subject to the will of one man, no matter what titles or constitutional arrangements were made. The assassins, calling themselves liberators, believed they were saving the Republic by killing the dictator. They were tragically wrong. The Republic was already dead, killed at Pharsalus when Caesar's legions proved that military force could overcome all constitutional restraints. Killing Caesar simply created a power vacuum that other ambitious men would fight to fill. The second wave of civil wars after Caesar's assassination was even more destructive than the first. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the second triumvirate and systematically proscribed their enemies, ordering the execution of thousands of senators, equestrians, and wealthy Romans whose property could be confiscated. The proscriptions of 43 BC were far bloodier than anything Caesar had done. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and a defender of the Republic, was murdered by Antony's soldiers, his head and hands cut off and displayed in the Forum. The political class that had governed Rome for centuries was decimated. The survivors learned to keep quiet and obey whoever held power. At Philippi in 42 BC in Macedonia, the forces of the liberators faced the armies of the Second Triumvirate. It was another massive battle between Roman armies, another 100,000 men fighting each other rather than Rome's enemies. The tactics used at Philippi showed clear influence from Pharsalus. Both sides employed mobile reserves, specialized units designed to counter specific threats. Both commanders sought to turn enemy flanks using combined infantry and cavalry forces. The liberators' forces were defeated, and the leaders Brutus and Cassius committed suicide. The Republic's last defenders were gone. Then the triumvirs turned on each other. Lepidus was sidelined, stripped of his provinces and armies. The conflict evolved into a struggle between Octavian, controlling the west, and Antony, controlling the east. This war lasted years, fought across the Mediterranean, until finally in 31 BC at Actium, off the coast of Greece, Octavian's fleet defeated Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt and committed suicide. Octavian was left as sole ruler of the Roman world. In 27 BC, Octavian took the title Augustus and became the first Roman emperor in all but name. He maintained republican forms, pretending the Senate still governed, carefully avoiding Caesar's mistake of appearing too openly as a monarch. But the reality was clear. Augustus wielded absolute power, backed by legions loyal to him personally. The system he created, the Principate, would govern Rome for the next 3 centuries. The chain of causation was direct. Caesar's victory at Pharsalus made him master of Rome. His assassination created chaos. That chaos was resolved through more civil wars, which ended with one-man rule under Augustus. The empire was born from Caesar's tactical genius on the plains of Thessaly. Every emperor who followed, from Tiberius to Constantine, ruled because of what happened that August morning in 48 BC when Roman infantry charged cavalry and won. The military legacy of Pharsalus extended far beyond Rome. Commanders throughout the ancient world studied the battle, trying to understand its lessons. In Parthia, military theorists analysed how Pompey's cavalry had been defeated, seeking ways to avoid similar disasters. Parthian cavalry tactics emphasised mobility and archery, fighting at a distance rather than closing for melee combat. They concluded that Pompey's mistake had been allowing his cavalry to become stationary and compressed. Parthian horse archers would never allow infantry to close with them. They would shoot from a distance, retreat if charged, refuse close combat. This approach proved effective when Rome invaded Parthia. Despite Rome's infantry superiority, the eastern campaigns were inconclusive, with disasters like the destruction of Crassus's army at Carrhae demonstrating that Roman tactics had limits against enemies who refused to fight on Roman terms. In Germania, tribal leaders heard stories of Pharsalus from merchants and travellers. The Germanic tribes relied heavily on shock cavalry charges by their noble warriors. Learning that Roman infantry could defeat cavalry in close combat reinforced their decision to avoid fighting Romans in open battle. Instead, Germanic tactics emphasized ambush, forest warfare, attacking supply lines, any strategy that prevented Rome from bringing its legionary infantry to bear in set-piece battles. The disaster at Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, where Germanic tribes annihilated 3 Roman legions, came from refusing to fight the kind of battle Romans excelled at. The Germans used terrain and surprise to negate Roman advantages, attacking in forests where formations couldn't deploy, where superior training and discipline mattered less than local knowledge and ferocity. In Gaul, now pacified and incorporated into Rome, former warriors who had fought against Caesar told stories of Pharsalus to their sons and grandsons. These stories emphasized not just Roman tactical skill, but Roman determination and discipline. The message was clear. Rome won not just because of clever tactics, but because Roman soldiers would attempt anything their commander ordered. They would charge cavalry. They would build walls across rivers. They would march through blizzards and deserts. This discipline, this willingness to suffer and fight beyond normal human endurance, was what made Rome unconquerable. The psychological impact of this reputation was immense. It convinced many peoples that resistance was futile, that Rome would eventually win through sheer persistence and military excellence. This defeatism made Roman conquest easier, as tribes and cities surrendered rather than face the legions. The physical landscape around Pharsalus changed after the battle. The field where 6,000 Romans died became a memorial site. Local Greeks erected monuments marking where the cavalry had been routed, where Pompey's camp had stood, where the final surrender had occurred. These monuments attracted visitors for centuries. Roman tourists travelling in Greece would detour to Pharsalus to see where the Republic had died. Guides offered tours, pointing out tactical positions, embellishing stories with dubious details. By the 2nd century AD, during Rome's peak, Pharsalus was a standard stop on the classical tourism route, along with Marathon, Thermopylae, and other famous battlefields. Archaeological evidence from the Pharsalus site, excavated by modern scholars, confirms the ancient accounts in remarkable detail. Weapon fragments recovered from the battlefield include javelin tips, sword blades, armour fragments, all showing patterns consistent with close-quarters infantry combat. The concentration of artefacts on the western part of the field, where Pompey's left wing had been positioned, confirms that this was the sector of heaviest fighting. Analysis of the weapon types shows a mix of Roman and Allied equipment, supporting accounts that Pompey's army included diverse forces from across the Mediterranean. Human remains found in mass graves near the ancient site show trauma patterns consistent with sword and javelin wounds. Modern forensic analysis of these remains provides gruesome confirmation of how deadly Roman close combat was. Skull injuries, severed limbs, multiple penetrating wounds — these were men who died in the chaos of hand-to-hand fighting, stabbed and hacked by enemies just inches away. The battlefield today is agricultural land, fields of wheat and corn covering the ground where empires clashed. A small museum in the nearby town displays artifacts and offers reconstructions of the battle. Tourists still visit, though in smaller numbers than in ancient times. Standing on the plain, looking toward the river where Caesar's left wing had been positioned, toward the open ground where his fourth line had charged Pompey's cavalry, it's possible to understand the terrain's role in the battle. The field is relatively flat, offering few natural defensive positions. Pompey chose to fight here because the openness favoured his cavalry's superiority. Caesar accepted battle here because he was desperate, because his army was starving, because he needed decisive action. Neither commander could have imagined that this obscure Greek plain would become one of history's most significant battlefields. The scholarly debate over Pharsalus continues today. Military historians argue about specific tactical details. How exactly did Caesar's fourth line form up? Were they truly concealed, or simply positioned where Pompey's attention wasn't focused? How did they maintain cohesion while charging cavalry? What specific commands did Caesar give? The ancient sources provide broad outlines but lack the tactical minutiae that modern analysts desire. Some scholars question whether the battle happened exactly as Caesar described in his commentaries. Caesar was writing propaganda as much as history, crafting a narrative that justified his actions and glorified his genius. His account emphasizes his own brilliance while downplaying luck and the contributions of subordinates. Some details in Caesar's account don't quite match those in other sources like Plutarch or Appian, suggesting some embellishment. However, the basic facts are undisputed. Caesar won decisively at Pharsalus while badly outnumbered. He defeated Pompey's cavalry using infantry tactics. He routed Pompey's army and destroyed it as an effective fighting force. The battle ended the civil war's first phase and made Caesar master of Rome. These facts, confirmed by multiple independent sources, are historical bedrock. The debate is over details, not the outcome or general course of the battle. Modern military analysis using computer simulations and tactical reconstruction supports the feasibility of Caesar's described tactics. Infantry can defeat cavalry under the right circumstances, especially when cavalry is caught in disorder and prevented from using its mobility advantages. The emphasis on aiming for faces, while brutal, shows sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Facial wounds create disproportionate psychological trauma. Cavalry, whose riders are worried about being blinded or disfigured, will not press home attacks with the aggression needed to break infantry formations. The Battle of Pharsalus also offers lessons for modern military theorists studying asymmetric warfare. Caesar faced an enemy with overwhelming advantages in cavalry, the ancient equivalent of modern mobile forces or armour. Rather than simply accepting this disadvantage, he created a specialized unit designed specifically to counter the threat. He positioned this unit where it could achieve surprise, waited for the optimal moment to commit it, and achieved decisive results. This approach, identifying enemy strengths, creating capabilities to counter those strengths, and employing those capabilities with perfect timing, remains relevant to modern warfare. Military academies today study Pharsalus alongside battles like Cannae, Austerlitz, and Midway as examples of how outnumbered forces can achieve victory through superior tactics and leadership. The human drama of Pharsalus extends beyond the battle itself to the aftermath. Caesar's clemency toward defeated enemies was genuine, though motivated by pragmatism. He understood that Rome couldn't survive if every political dispute ended with the losing side being slaughtered. His policy of forgiveness, of welcoming former enemies into positions of responsibility, was revolutionary in Roman politics. It was also ultimately futile. Many of the men Caesar pardoned after Pharsalus would join the conspiracy to assassinate him. Marcus Brutus, perhaps Caesar's illegitimate son, certainly a man Caesar loved as a son, led the assassins. Brutus had fought for Pompey at Pharsalus. Caesar pardoned him and promoted him. 4 years later, Brutus drove a knife into Caesar's chest. The famous last words, "Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus," whether historically accurate or Shakespeare's invention, captured the betrayal Caesar must have felt. Was Caesar's clemency a mistake? Should he have followed traditional Roman practice and proscribed his enemies, executing the leaders and confiscating their property? If he had done so, would he have survived? We cannot know. What we know is that Caesar chose a different path, attempted to build a new political system based on reconciliation rather than revenge, and was murdered for his trouble. The assassins justified their actions as saving the Republic from tyranny. In reality, they condemned Rome to more civil wars, more bloodshed, more tyranny under Augustus that was simply better disguised than Caesar's rule had been. The Republic they claimed to be saving was already gone, destroyed by structural problems that had been building for a century, problems that Pharsalus merely made undeniable. The common soldiers who fought at Pharsalus, on both sides, were largely forgotten by history. We know the names of a few centurions, a handful of cavalry officers. We know Caesar and Pompey, Labienus, and Mark Antony. But the thousands of legionaries who actually fought and died are anonymous. They left no written records. Their individual stories are lost. Yet they were human beings with hopes and fears, families waiting for them at home, reasons for fighting beyond abstract political disputes. The soldiers in Caesar's fourth line who charged the cavalry were men, not chess pieces. They felt fear when they saw 7,000 horsemen bearing down on them. They bled when javelins and swords found gaps in their armour. They died far from home, buried in mass graves on a Greek plain. Some of the Pompeian cavalry who fled were young aristocrats who had joined the army seeking glory, who found themselves in a nightmare of violence they weren't prepared for. Some probably went home and never spoke of their experience, ashamed of their flight, haunted by images of their comrades dying around them. The Pompeian infantry who surrendered after the battle faced an uncertain future. Caesar pardoned them, but pardon didn't mean they could simply go home. Many were enrolled in Caesar's legions, required to serve the man they had fought against. Some deserted at first opportunity. Others served loyally, finding that Caesar paid well and treated his soldiers better than their former commanders had. Within a year, former Pompeian soldiers were fighting alongside Caesar's veterans, the divisions of civil war papered over by shared military service. This was Roman pragmatism at its finest. The Republic couldn't afford to lose 24,000 trained soldiers just because they had chosen the wrong side, so they were pardoned, fed, equipped, and sent to fight Rome's enemies whether they wanted to or not. The veterans of Pharsalus who survived to see peace found themselves in a transformed world. Rome was becoming an empire, though that word wasn't yet used officially. The political system they had known was gone. The Senate was filled with Caesar's appointees and later Augustus's supporters. The assemblies that had elected magistrates became rubber stamps for imperial decisions. Military service, once tied to citizenship and civic duty, became a professional career. Soldiers served 20 or 25-year terms, received regular pay, and retired with land grants or cash bonuses. The legions became standing armies loyal to emperors, not temporary levies loyal to the Republic. For the veterans, this meant security and predictability. No more wondering if they would be paid. No more uncertainty about retirement benefits. The emperors needed loyal armies and paid well for that loyalty. But it also meant the end of the citizen-soldier ideal, the Roman farmer who took up arms when needed and returned to his plough after victory. Rome's armies became professional, efficient, and divorced from the civilian society they protected. This professionalization had roots in earlier reforms, particularly those of Marius in 107 BC, who had opened legion recruitment to landless citizens. But Pharsalus accelerated the trend. After the civil wars, Augustus established a standing army of 28 legions stationed on frontiers throughout the empire. These legions were professional military formations, their soldiers enlisted for decades-long terms, their loyalty purchased with regular pay and retirement benefits. The soldiers who served in these legions were descendants, literally and figuratively, of the men who had fought at Pharsalus. They inherited tactics, discipline, and traditions from Caesar's veterans. They also inherited the fundamental loyalty structure: soldiers who served their commander personally, whose first allegiance was to the man who paid them, rather than to abstract civic principles. The Battle of Pharsalus stands as a pivot point in Western history. Before Pharsalus, Rome was a republic, flawed and struggling, but still governed by elected officials and constitutional principles. After Pharsalus, Rome was an autocracy, ruled by one man no matter what titles disguised that reality. Before Pharsalus, Roman military tactics assumed that cavalry was handled by cavalry, that infantry fought infantry, that combined arms meant coordinating different unit types rather than having one type counter another's specialty. After Pharsalus, Roman doctrine included specialized anti-cavalry tactics, mobile reserves, flexible formations that could adapt mid-battle to changing circumstances. Before Pharsalus, generals like Pompey were considered supreme masters of warfare. After Pharsalus, Caesar stood alone as history's greatest military mind, at least until successors like Hannibal and Napoleon could be fairly compared across centuries. On that August day in 48 BC, when 3,000 Roman legionaries charged 7,000 cavalry with javelins aimed at faces, when young aristocratic horsemen fled rather than risk disfigurement, when Caesar's fourth line wheeled inward and destroyed Pompey's left wing, the ancient world changed forever. The Republic died on the plains of Pharsalus. The empire was born there, and the lesson was clear for anyone who understood. Military genius combined with absolute loyalty from professional soldiers could overcome any constitutional restraint, defeat any numerical advantage, and reshape civilization itself. The liberators who later assassinated Caesar learned this lesson too late. They killed the man but couldn't kill what he represented, the dawn of a new age where military power determined political legitimacy. Augustus and his imperial successors understood perfectly. They maintained Caesar's military system, his professional legions, his tactics, his emphasis on combined arms and flexible doctrine. They paid his veterans' descendants to guard the frontiers and crush internal dissent. They ruled an empire built on the foundations Caesar had laid at Pharsalus. For 5 centuries, until the Western Empire's fall in the 5th century AD, Rome dominated the Mediterranean world and beyond. That dominance, that empire, that transformation of ancient civilization, all traced directly back to the moment when Roman infantry defeated heavy cavalry on a Greek battlefield. The thunder of hoofbeats, the clash of steel, the cries of wounded men, the smell of blood and dust, these sensations faded within hours. But their consequences echoed through history, shaping the world we inherited, making us all in some sense children of Pharsalus.